Our next speaker in the Kuhn 100 conference at the University of Bucharest is Professor Lydia Patton from Virginia Tech. It is a pleasure and an honor to be able to welcome Lydia. I've known her for quite some time, and I am delighted to enrich the conference with her talk. She will be speaking about anti-foundationalism in Kuhn and logical empiricism. Lydia, please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I only wish I could actually be in Romania, but maybe someday in the future. But it's a great pleasure. Yes, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be able to speak. So let me share some slides quickly. Here we are. And then I need to sorry. Can everyone see my slides now? We're good? Okay, excellent. Wonderful. All right, so my talk is called Anti-Foundationalism in Kuhn and Logical Empiricism. And this might seem appropriate in the case of Kuhn and less so in the case of logical empiricism. And of course, that's what I'm going to try to persuade you of, at least to a certain extent by the end of the talk, is that it's appropriate in both cases. So history has portrayed Thomas Kuhn as putting the nail in the coffin of the logical empiricist picture of science. So Peter Galison has a 1988 paper, a very nice paper, where he portrays the clash between Kuhn and logical empiricism as a conflict between the empiricist belief in progress and modernism and Kuhn's view of scientific change as akin to a Gestalt shift or a religious conversion. According to this reading, while Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius were stripping buildings of ornament, so this is the sort of modernist position, Carnap and Reichenbach were stripping the metaphysics away from theories, revealing their basic structure of observations. This is a very nice narrative that Galison gives us. Science modernizes and makes progress insofar as it is continuous with the ever cumulative set of observations made in empirical investigations. So Kuhn's structure thus can be read as a movement, which also included Feyerabend and Hesse, away from the view associated with empiricism and positivism. Some readings of this Kuhnian countercurrent see it as a crucial move away from the excesses of empiricism and positivism, sometimes associated explicitly with the Vienna Circle, which strip away social and political frameworks of understanding, reducing science to an artificially objective practice, complicit in imposing a technocratic vision on civil society. The logical empiricists themselves did not see things this way. Logical empiricism, as Thomas Übel and others have explicitly noted, and I'm going to be depending a great deal on Übel's work in this talk, was conceived in opposition to a current of irrationalism in National Socialism, including the blood and soil rhetoric and the romanticized idea, racist idea, of a special path for Aryan Germany. Articulating a distinct vision of political community to the left Vienna Circle involved showing that progress toward the common goals of humanity didn't involve romantic or metaphysical thinking that was available only to a select group or race. Rather, it could be achieved through a common project available to everyone. The pursuit of scientific knowledge about how to solve the problems facing humanity and the understanding of those problems in terms of observations that are in principle accessible to anyone in a society. So here on the left, of course, we have one of Neurath's isotype illustrations. And well, it's not an illustration, it's an isotype. And the idea behind it is to, the idea behind isotype in general was to present information in a way that was easily accessible and indeed publicly accessible. And Donata Rumizzi, in a very nice article in the journal Hopos in 2012, has argued that the Vienna Circle's scientific world conception brings their philosophy of science into the political arena and, in fact, constitutes political engagement on the part of the Vienna Circle. So from the left Vienna Circle perspective, then, Kuhn's project might even be viewed as a step backwards. So instead of presenting science as founded on common empirical knowledge, or so the story might go, Kuhn presents science as a kind of Gnostic practice, and again, this is the objection that we're imagining, in which knowledge under a paradigm is available only to those initiated into that paradigm. Of particular importance for this paper, Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions, or so we might say, cast them as ultimately irrational, motivated by reasons other than empirical ones. This was a common objection to Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions. And this, we might assume, should be anathema to the logical empiricism of the Vienna Circle. Recent scholarship has recast the relationship between Kuhn and logical empiricism on several fronts. And here I'm thinking of the work of Michael Friedman, of course, on reconsidering logical positivism, but also Stefano Gattai, Sean Morris, Pinto de Oliveira has some nice work on this. This paper continues in this revisionist vein, presenting evidence and reasoning in partial support of a set of claims. In the conclusion of the paper, I'll summarize the main claims for which the paper argues, but they're all related to a guiding theme, which is found on this slide. The Vienna Circle and Kuhn do not disagree as much as has been assumed on the question of empirical foundations for scientific knowledge. And in fact, Kuhn and the logical empiricists are empirical anti-foundationalists. I'm not the first to argue this, but I am going to argue for this point. So first, we can turn to Kuhn's anti-foundationalism. So in the first two chapters of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn argues against the accumulationist picture of the growth of science on several grounds. According to the accumulationist picture, scientists amass observations that are essentially the same in character and that can be directly compared to each other. This is my paraphrase of what Kuhn says about this. It's not directly from Kuhn. The essence and characteristics of these observations motivate changes to their interpretation via theory and methods of observation. Theories and explanations, however, are entirely independent of empirical data and observations. So to be clear, this is the position Kuhn is arguing against. This is the accumulationist picture, according to which science just amasses results over time, and there's no major difference in the way that it interprets them. The accumulationist picture thus is associated with two other accounts of science: the assertion that observation is independent of theory, and modernism in Gallison's sense about scientific progress. According to accumulationism, evidence doesn't depend on the framework used to gather or interpret it, and so it's not theory or framework dependent. So according to the accumulationist picture, evidence doesn't depend on the theory or the framework that we're using. Science makes progress by collecting evidence as a whole and assessing to what extent proposed theories account for that evidence or not. In structure, the accumulationist picture is contrasted with the Kuhnian narrative, according to which the history of science consists of periods of normal science, punctuated by deep fissures and upheavals, namely revolutionary science. Kuhn distinguishes between revolutionary and normal science by means of the often misunderstood idea of a paradigm. So to Kuhn, a paradigm is a scientific achievement, among other definitions, of such magnitude, novelty, and depth that it strikes out in a new direction, and indeed defines that new direction and work within it. Paradigms are the basis for what Kuhn calls normal science. In other words, solving scientific puzzles under the paradigm. And we've seen today several talks talking about this exact problem. So it's already clear that there are anti-foundationalist elements in Kuhn. Again, as I've said, the hard part of this talk is not really arguing that Kuhn is an anti-foundationalist. That's not a very controversial argument. But one thing that I do want to point out is that there are there is a particular aspect of Kuhn's anti-foundationalism that I think is important to note, because it's what I'm going to compare to logical empiricism in the part of the talk where we get to talking about logical empiricists. So this notion is methodological incommensurability. And I'm going to characterize this notion of methodological incommensurability from a book edited by Paul Hoyningen-Huene and Howard Sankey that came out in 2001 called Incommensurability in Related Matters. And here in the introduction to this book, Hoyningen-Huene and Sankey lay out the notion of methodological incommensurability. And these include So Huynigan, Hune, and Sankey distinguish two types of Kuhnian incommensurability, methodological and semantic. Semantic incommensurability is the well-known phenomenon of meaning variance across theoretical frameworks. So what Aristotle calls motion is not Newtonian motion, and so one can't interpret the statements of Aristotelian physics in the semantic framework of Newtonian physics without getting it wrong. And this is, of course, well known from Kuhn's paper reprinted in The Essential Tension, What Are Scientific Revolution? Methodological incommensurability is distinct. Cite from Huynigan, Hune, and Sankey, talking about what methodological incommensurability amounts to. First, according to the thesis of methodological incommensurability, there are no shared objective methodological standards of scientific theory appraisal. Standards of theory appraisal vary from one paradigm to another. There are no external or neutral standards which may be employed in the comparative evaluation of competing theories. So what we note here is that the standards of how to weigh the evidence for a theory, how to weigh the truth or the results of a theory vary from paradigm to paradigm. And most importantly, there's no shared set of external or neutral standards from which we can weigh different theories, all on a par. That's very important. As a result, they conclude alternative scientific theories may be incommensurable due to the absence of common methodological standards capable of adjudicating the choice between them. If two paradigms are incommensurable, we might argue, then evidence for one does not necessarily constitute evidence either for or against the other. Statements in one paradigm don't have the same meaning in another paradigm because terms are defined differently. That's the usual semantic or lexical incommensurability. But methodological incommensurability adds up to the claim that we don't assess or evaluate claims in the same way in the two paradigms. And so there's no common standard we can use to judge competing paradigms. So the incommensurability of paradigms thus leads in Kuhn to a radical kind of anti-foundationalism, as expected. Foundationalism in general can be defined as the claim, and this is from Thomas Übel's 1996 paper, Anti-Foundationalism and the Vienna Circle's Revolution in Philosophy, which not surprisingly will be a big source for what I'm going to say later. Foundationalism in general can be defined as the following claim. This is from Übel. All knowledge claims can ultimately be decided by reference to statements belonging to a class, the members of which can be decided on their own. That is, statements which are non-inferentially justified. So this is simply the idea that there can be a foundation for knowledge, empirical or not. Empirical foundationalism, of course, goes beyond this, and it involves two claims that I'm going to use that are adapted from Übel's definition of anti-foundationalism, of foundationalism in general. So empirical foundationalism involves the following two claims. First, empirical observations constitute an independent domain that is non-inferentially justified. And second, justification of knowledge claims is by reference to empirical observations, independently of any particular framework, that is, a theory or a paradigm. Foundationalism requires an account of empirical observation, according to which that observation is independent of any particular theory, approach, or framework. Thus, empirical foundationalism is usually considered to be inconsistent with Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions, and in particular with the thesis of the incommensurability of successive paradigms. If there's an autonomous domain of empirical observation, and if our knowledge claims can be justified directly by reference to that domain, then there can be no incommensurability between the frameworks we use to establish knowledge, or so we might argue. For a foundationalist, empirical foundationalist, all our knowledge is ultimately referred to the empirical domain of observation, and that domain is a single domain, independent of theories, paradigms, and frameworks. It's a foundational domain that doesn't require inferential justification. Later in Kuhn's career in the 1980s, Kuhn argues explicitly against the idea of an ultimate foundation for knowledge, prominently including an empirical foundation. And here there's been a recent paper in Hopos called The Discovery, Justification, Distinction, and the New Historiography of Science, focusing on Thomas Kuhn's Thalheimer lectures by Pablo Melonio. And Kuhn makes this argument in the context of arguing against the traditional static view of scientific theories. Now, it's important to notice that the traditional view of scientific theories and the accumulationist picture of science and its progress have frequently been identified with logical empiricism. And so we're starting to slowly get into the logical empiricists and their view. One reason for this is the long-standing reading of the Vienna Circle as, and this is a nice quote from Ubel, a version of British empiricism prettied up by the then new tools of formal logic. The position that is alleged by this reading to be logical empiricism. So this is the reading where we're going to say that Kuhn and the logical empiricists are implacably opposed to each other, that the logical empiricists are empirical foundationalists and Kuhn is not. This reading, I'm going to argue, depends on a kind of straw man. And here I'm going to rely to an extent on the work of Sebastian Lutz, who has a nice paper in Hopos in 2012. So much Hopos work that is great. Sebastian Lutz's paper talks about a straw man in the history of philosophy of science, namely the sort of simplistic readings of the received view of logical empiricism. So there's a kind of caricature view that's very tempting and very plausible in some ways, but that is somewhat has been criticized by recent revisionist readings of logical empiricism. And according to this characterization, so again, this is the characterization that I and others are going to oppose. The logical empiricists argue that scientific reasoning is ultimately based on a foundation of empirical observation, and only direct statements about empirical observations are meaningful, right? So that only is very important. According to this caricatured view, all meaningful statements in a theoretical language must be reduced to statements in the observation language, and there's no other way, you can't say anything without reducing it to a statement in an observation language. This can be done by introducing coordinating principles or correspondence rules that allow for a straightforward reduction of theoretical statements to observational ones, or by establishing experimental protocols enabling demonstrations that theoretical statements are really statements about observations. Now, on the one hand, I think there's, of course, a lot to be said for this, for something like this reading of the positions of the Vienna Circle of Carnap and Schlick and Reichenbach and the others. However, I do think that we should know better by now, given the new research that's been done, than to reduce the complex, nuanced positions taken by the Vienna Circle overall to only the simplistic version given in the previous paragraph. So it's not that I'm saying that there's nothing that the Vienna Circle has said that could be read in this way, but it's that I think that there's much more to be said about what the Vienna Circle, about the arguments of the Vienna Circle. As Ubel noted in this paper from 1996, that as you can tell I really like, the Vienna Circle comprised quite different and even incompatible approaches to the philosophy of science, none of which rehash traditionalist, foundationalist epistemology. So a lasting achievement of the reconsideration of logical empiricism in the 1990s and 2000s was the overturning of the readings of the Vienna Circle that restricted their account to only these positions. For instance, extended scholarly reconsideration of the protocol sentence debate has established that even in the 1930s, the positions of the logical empiricists can't be understood accurately only as forms of traditional empirical foundationalism or associated versions of materialist reductionism. Now, of course, Kuhn himself may have believed that the empiricist foundationalist reading of logical empiricism that certainly is associated with figures like A.J. Ayer and Quine and others, Kuhn may have thought that that reading was correct. And Kuhn may have intended to criticize logical empiricist positions, both in structure and in the Thalheimer lectures of the 1980s. But if so, sorry, went too quickly. If so, he was wrong on the first count, and so his criticisms, if they were intended as criticisms of logical empiricism, missed their mark. So I think that Ubel's paper, for instance, and his work in general, effectively undermines the foundationalist reading of the logical empiricists overall. But Sebastian Lutz's paper also shows that similar criticisms of the received view, the view associated with the Vienna Circle, are mustered against a straw man. The traditional account of science that Kuhn criticizes in the Thalheimer lectures has little in common with the received view as Lutz illuminates it. So if Kuhn was criticizing the received view in structure or in the Thalheimer lectures, he was criticizing a straw man. One could perhaps argue that the earlier positions of the Vienna Circle more closely resemble the traditional picture of science that Kuhn is criticizing, or even the accumulationist picture criticized in structure. But, and I can't say much about this now, but we could definitely follow up on it in the question period, I think that that's still questionable, although possibly more defensible. But even if it were true, why would Kuhn choose to criticize those earlier positions in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and not the more nuanced pictures that the main that the main figures of the Vienna Circle developed in the 40s and 50s and beyond? So it's sort of odd if it's true that the positions of the Vienna Circle that Kuhn was criticizing in structure were actually their earlier positions. Why would that be the case? Why wouldn't he have criticized the more up-to-date positions of the Vienna Circle? So why would he still associate them with their earlier work? I mean, it's quite possible that he did, but it seems like a strange thing to do. But that's not what I want to focus on in the second part of the talk. Instead, I want to focus on a particular case, namely the case of Rudolf Carnap, the case of Carnap as an example of someone from the Vienna Circle. And I want to argue that from the perspective of the specific form of empirical anti-foundationalism that was discussed above, there is and from that perspective only, right? I don't want to argue this in general. There is very little difference between Kuhn's position in structure and Carnap's position in the 1950s and 60s. So first, I want to focus on Carnap's 1950 paper, Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology, which is one of the great later works of logical empiricism. The central question of the paper is about the relationship between meaning and semantics on the one hand and ontology on the other. Abstract entities seem to pose a challenge to empiricism, since commitment to abstract entities as features of a theory or explanation seems to come along with assertion of their existence. But that may come with an unwelcome implication. To assert that the entities involved in scientific theories exist implies the existence of entities that violate empiricist tenets, right? So Carnap is well aware of this tension within empiricism. That is, it implies commitment to unobservable, infinite, or abstract entities. In order to understand how this works, Carnap in Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology introduces the notion of a framework. And so this whole quote on this page is all from Carnap in the 1950 paper. If someone wishes to speak in his language about a new kind of entities, he has to introduce a system of new ways of speaking subject to new rules. We shall call this procedure the construction of a framework for the new entities in question. And now we must distinguish two kinds of questions of existence. First, questions of the existence of certain entities of the new kind within the framework. We call them internal questions. And second, questions concerning the existence of the framework itself, called external questions. And this is a continuation of that quote. Internal questions and possible answers to them are formulated with the help of new forms of expressions. The answers may be found either by purely logical methods or by empirical methods. So the answers to the question of whether something exists, depending upon whether the framework is a logical or a factual one. An external question is of a problematic character, which is in need of closer examination. So the distinction between internal and external questions ultimately resolves, for Carnap, the problem of the existence of abstract entities. We may be committed to the existence of the complex plane, for instance, because we've constructed a scientific framework that involves the postulation of the complex plane. Oh, sorry, I keep moving too far forward, sorry. But that commitment doesn't imply that the complex plane is real externally to the framework, right? So we might be committed to the existence of a complex plane because we've made decisions up higher in the framework that commit us to that existence claim. But that doesn't mean that we are committed to the idea externally that the complex plane is real in some broader sense outside the framework. Independently of the framework, the question of the reality of the complex plane might not even make sense. Postulating the framework is a necessary condition for the assertion of the existence of the complex plane to have meaning, which is, of course, one of the key questions for Carnap. Carnap goes on to argue, in fact, that the distinction between internal and external questions for frameworks can be applied even to the world of things, to our ordinary experience of spatiotemporally extended objects. Speaking the thing language, Carnap argues, involves commitment to a framework of things that determines how our empirical investigations will answer questions about ordinary objects. Even ordinary experience, he says, involves prior commitment to a thing language that engages the framework for how our empirical investigations will be used to establish statements about the existence and qualities of external things. Scientific frameworks involve further specification of rules for the evaluation of claims and inferences. Within a given framework, whether for ordinary experience or for a particular type of scientific investigation, we can define internal questions regarding the existence and properties of things. So this is back to me, this is not a Carnap quote anymore, although it's intended to summarize his view for sure. Those questions may even involve assertions about whether objects are real, whether they're external to the subject of knowledge, whether they're mind independent, and so on. But outside the framework, we can make little sense of the reality of these objects. Posing the question, are these objects real, requires answering other questions first. Which objects? How are they individuated? What empirical observations would confirm their reality? And answers to all of these questions, even in the case of ordinary experience, requires taking positions within a framework, Carnap says. Asking them as external questions makes little sense. So at this point, let's recall the two claims characteristic of empirical foundationalism that were stated above. First, empirical observations must constitute an independent domain that is non-inferentially justified, for a view to be empirically foundationalist. Second, justification of knowledge claims is by reference to empirical observations, independently of any particular framework, that is, a theory or paradigm, or simply a Carnapian framework. Empirical foundationalism requires an account of empirical observation, according to which it is a non-inferentially justified domain, independent of any particular theory, approach, or framework. From the logical syntax of language onward, at the very least, Carnap expresses positions that are inconsistent with empirical foundationalism in this sense. To Carnap, empirical observation is not meaningful on its own. It requires a prior linguistic, syntactic, or semantic framework. These frameworks do not depend on a prior assessment of a mass of non-inferential knowledge gathered via empirical observation. It's the other way around. Assessing the implications of observations for scientific reasoning requires the prior assertion of what Carnap calls meaning postulates. And the reasoning that applies in Carnap's case applies mutatis mutandis, or at least so I will argue. Well, I won't argue very much in this talk, but I would argue for this claim if I had time, to Hans Hahn, Moritz Schlick, Hans Reichenbach, and the others. It's no more defensible to assert that the other members of the inner circle, the other logical empiricists, were empirical foundationalists than it is to assert this in the case of Carnap. In most cases, they were empirical anti-foundationalists in the sense that has been described here. Now, of course, there are going to be obvious objections to what I'm arguing for here. And one counter argument might be to say that my definition of empirical foundationalism itself is too narrow or restrictive. It's just the reference to the empirical that is foundationalist, we might argue. So here we might define empirical foundationalism quite simply as any statement or claim must be properly connected with empirical observations to be justified. So we might say that that's what we mean by empirical foundationalism. It's just this proper connection with empirical foundationalism, well, with empirical observations, sorry. And in that case, it's absolutely true. If we define empirical foundationalism in this way and not in the stronger way mentioned earlier, then the logical empiricists do count as empirical foundationalists. Now, one problem is that this definition of empirical foundationalism makes quite a few philosophers empirical foundationalists, including prominently Immanuel Kant, who argues for exactly this point. It seems, therefore, to me, rather overly permissive as a definition. So while my definition of empirical foundationalism might seem too restrictive, I think this definition of empirical foundationalism lets tons of people in who I don't think would really count as an empirical foundationalist. Of course, you know, tastes differ, and the idea might be that, well, this definition is preferable because it's more reasonable and it allows for more philosophers to be included. In particular, in the case of the logical empiricist, we might want to take this more permissive definition seriously when comparing Kuhn to the logical empiricists in particular, because this objection is telling when it's applied to controversies over Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions. These revolutions involve deliberate changes to the fundamental approach to solving scientific problems, the paradigm that a particular scientific community adopts. So in particular, one objection to Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions focuses on our inability to provide a rational reconstruction of paradigm shifts. Scientific method, we might argue, and this criticism was made by Lakatos and others in this classic book that I've got on the screen. So we might argue that scientific method requires that we be able to show how we made an inference from empirical observation to the change of fundamental approach involved in a paradigm shift. Since the term rational reconstruction is associated with Rudolf Carnap, many have viewed this as an objection coming from a standpoint that's consistent with logical empiricism, or even coming from logical empiricism. So one might argue then that the demand for rational reconstruction is in fact a demand for ultimate explanation of Kuhnian paradigm shifts grounded in empirical observation alone, and that this is actually coming from the logical empiricist camp. But this is false. At least by 1950, Carnap's rational reconstruction was not intended to explain the choice of fundamental axioms, rules, or concepts that establish a framework using the scientific methodology that's employed within a given theory or framework. Carnap's essay, Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology, explicitly defines considerations about the initial choice of a framework as an external question, one that cannot be rationally reconstructed within a scientific framework or methodology. It's actually, I'm not the first person to note this. It is very striking how much this resembles Kuhn's account in structure. It was Imre Lakatos in the book that I had up on the last screen, Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge, who demanded rational reconstruction of Kuhnian revolutions, not Carnap. So I will argue that Kuhn and I would argue that Kuhn and the logical empiricists were aligned. They're both empirical anti-foundationalists. And here, I just want to say something very, very quickly, and then I'll sum up because I know I'm getting to the end of time. But I actually want to say just quickly that Kuhn's criticisms of accumulationism and foundationalism are actually much better aimed at a quite different philosophical tradition. So beginning at least in the 1950s and 1960s, mainstream philosophy featured prominent and even dominant trends that actually did involve empirical foundationalism, including multiple forms of material reductionism and physicalism in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. Texts from just before the time of structure include J.J.C. Smart's book, Ernst Nagel, sorry, I'm mispronouncing everybody's name, and Khomeini and Oppenheim, their text from 1956. So this is all work in the philosophy of science, working from a materialist and reductionist perspective. When Kuhn gave the Thalheimer lectures in the 1980s, Carnap had been dead for over a decade. But, oh my gosh, I always mix them up. I meant Thomas. Yeah, but Jaegwon Kim was still alive. The Churchlands were still alive, and of course, so was Daniel Dennett. Philosophical arguments identifying mind processes with brain processes, or giving arguments that there's an empirical or material domain that provides an ultimate justification for scientific reasoning, were thick on the ground, but not really prominently from logical empiricists. So in concluding, the following claims, I believe, are well supported by the reconsideration of logical empiricism that's taken place since the 1990s. Not only is it crucial to appreciate the empirical anti-foundationalism that the logical empiricists and Kuhn had in common, in my view, it's also key to understand that the real 20th century empirical foundationalists, were to be found elsewhere in newer positions in philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. So in closing, I just want to say 3 claims that I think are justified, again, by the reconsideration of logical positivism, and just in the particular context of looking at the relationship between logical positivism, logical empiricism, and Kuhn's account in Structure and in the Thalheimer lectures. The first claim is that Kuhn did take positions against traditional empirical foundationalism. These positions are more plausibly associated with traditional Baconian empiricism and late 20th century physicalism and reductionism than with the logical empiricists. And I should say here that I don't actually intend to be saying anything deep about Bacon here, so I'm sure there are others who can correct me if I'm wrong about this statement. The second claim, by 1950, there was little difference between mainline logical empiricist positions on empirical foundationalism and Kuhn's. For instance, in my view, Carnap's position in empiricism, semantics, and ontology of 1950 is indistinguishable from Kuhn's in Structure from obviously 1962, with respect to one claim at least, that there is no ultimate empirical foundation for the choice of fundamental axioms, concepts, and logical structures of a theory, what Carnap calls a framework and Kuhn calls a paradigm. The third claim is that Kuhn himself may have believed that he was undermining traditional logical empiricism with the publication of Structure. But the flat-footed empiricist picture of the Vienna Circle is not accurate, and Kuhn's anti-foundationalism is closer to the positions of the logical empiricists than he himself may have been aware. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in applauding your work. Thank you. And next up, we move to Q&A. If there are some questions, comments, rejoinders, Theo, please go ahead.
Oh, you're muted.
I was just thanking Lydia for a wonderful talk. Now, I'm convinced by the argument, but I'm wondering about the historical character of logical empiricism. The views of logical empiricists developed over time. And right. if we go back in the 20s and 30s, and if we look at the protocol sentences debate, I think that some people defended foundationalist positions, right? So unless I'm badly mistaken, but that's what I remember. So if that's the case, then that may weaken your argument a bit. You may say that logical empiricism in some of its instantiations, Carnap in the 50s and 60s, was not foundationalism, but other people perhaps at the time, you mentioned Nagel. Nagel in a way was a logical empiricist, or it was in that tradition. I mean, it's broadly conceived. I would hesitate to lump everything under logical empiricism. I mean, there were different people at different times, and perhaps we should look at particular cases and at particular times to see whether the positions that they defended could count as foundationalist or not.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you. And I think, so I should say, you know, for instance, in the case of Carnap, like his position changed massively between the 20s and 30s and the 50s and 60s, which is a great, you know, it's a virtue of his career that he really reconsidered a lot of his positions and moved forward on them. So I'll say I cheated a little bit in this paper because of course I say logical empiricism, but what I'm really talking about is the relationship between Kuhn and logical empiricism. And there I think I'm on firmer ground because I completely agree with everything that you just said, right? I think that's absolutely right, that that the earlier positions in the protocol sentence debate, I think I said something in the paper about that not everyone was a foundationalist, but there certainly were foundationalists in that debate. You know, Neurath certainly took very hardline positions on, you know, Otto is in time, in space S at time T sort of thing, you know, and sees a green patch sort of justification for knowledge, right? And but I think that what I focus on in this paper is, well, look, but structure was in the 1960s. Right. And the Thalheimer lectures were in 1980. And so if we look at, and those are two of the really prominent places where Kuhn goes after empirical foundationalism and the traditional picture of knowledge and so forth. And in both of those cases, it would have been very strange, or so I would argue, for him to go after like 1930s Vienna Circle, right? Why would he have done that? And so I think at the very least, it's worth pointing out, there were very few people in the original Vienna Circle anyway, or in the Mach Circle, the Mach Verein, right, who were defending sort of mainline empiricist foundationalism. Now, of course, you did get people like Nagel. You got people who were in some sense on the, you know, influenced directly by logical empiricism to the extent to which they could be called sort of a later part of the circle, the expanding circle, maybe. But I think that it's just, there's this kind of historical view that I want to shake up a bit, that Kuhn killed logical empiricism, right? That like Carnap and Reichenbach and Schlick were all these just very straightforward empiricist foundationalists, and that Kuhn completely disagreed with them and he rooted out their account. And I'm like, well, really people like, and here again, you've raised exactly the right question, was Hempel a logical empiricist or not, right? But people like Hempel and Nagel were really the ones who Kuhn was going up against by that time. Carnap agreed with him. That's kind of my point in the paper. So that, yeah. Thank you. That's exactly the point I want to bring out. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question and answer. If there are other questions, comments, rejoinders, Daniela, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Well, of course, I totally agree with your ideas that in the end, and there is a lot of evidence that Kuhn, well, nothing against Carnap, he even published his book. So, but my question is, so that means, and even the correspondence between the two, there is no conflict apparently. But my question is that after all, when Kuhn published this idea, and he has struggled for decades to let other philosophers, and basically Quine, Davidson, who of course derived from Carnap, to have his idea accepted, or Patton, and that was his major frustration in the end in life. So my question is that if Quine, Davidson, Patton, and so on have thought that after all, Kuhn's ideas of incommensurability in a way could be assimilated to Carnap's view, they would have probably not accepted it, but at least try to understand it. And the dialogue is clearly a dialogue de sourds between them. And even Kuhn in the end, in the last interview, he tried to assess, well, I've tried basically to let them understand, and he constantly reformulated this idea of incommensurability to let them at least, if not accept, in a way, dialogue. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic point to raise, because I think and I think that both of these points, both of these questions bring up the really important point about that there are two questions when we talk about whether Kuhn's structure is inconsistent with logical empiricism or is inconsistent with the later philosophical sort of Harvard philosophy from Davidson and Quine, right? And there's a philosophical question, right? Are they inconsistent in general? And then there's a kind of historical question of who was taken to be a logical empiricist at which point, right? Or who was taken to be a sort of mainstream philosopher of science. Because I think one of the points that I want to kind of gently push back against is the idea that Kuhn was completely out of step with philosophy of science overall, right? That there was everything that he said was just completely inconsistent with what the logical empiricists had to say. And I think that one thing that is definitely true is that, well, of course, the original Vienna Circle by the 50s and 60s, that was their, they were getting older, it was their kind of last hurrah, right? And so then Kuhn's relationship to philosophy, which has been a theme all day today, became much more about his relationship to people like Davidson and Quine, as you bring up, Ayer and others. And I think, and then I think also there were other people who were more on the scene, like Hempel and Nagel. And that's in a way my point, is that like who counted as a logical empiricist at that point was really more Hempel, Nagel, even possibly Salmon, but possibly. Like who was a logical empiricist, right? And I think that it just wasn't the original Vienna Circle at that stage and at that point in time. And we've kind of, and so that's it, but that's not a philosophical question, that's a historical question. And so I think this is what's very interesting about what you're bringing up here, is that like at this point, like who really counted as a philosopher, who counted as a philosopher of science, a philosopher of language, and who was Kuhn really going up against? And I think the, Hasuk Chang has some brilliant work about Kuhn's relationship to like Quine and Davidson and others in the Harvard tradition. And there are others who have pointed out, and I think rightly, that Kuhn kind of gave up a lot of his, as you point out, like he tried to be very, very, very flexible and give up a lot of his positions in debate with other philosophers. And I think, so I think that to me is almost grist to my mill that, he wasn't someone who wanted to come in and just like blow up philosophy of science and do something completely, like that wasn't what he wanted to do. That's what he was perceived as doing. But that doesn't seem to have really been his intention, which is an interesting point. And which is not to say, I don't want to say that what he did not constitute, and so I'm on a kind of a precipice here, right? I don't want to say that what he did wasn't revolutionary, because I think actually it is true that what he wanted to do was directly inconsistent with what a lot of philosophers of language and philosophers of science at the time wanted to do, like, and like Popper and Hempel and Nagel and others. And so I think interestingly, though, his fight was really with them, not so much with Carnap or Reichenbach, who by that time were not really, A, they weren't really disagreeing with him, and B, they weren't really the sort of new forces coming out in philosophy of science. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. Daniel, any follow-up?
I was just thanking her.
Okay. Well, I'd like to sort of follow up my own, if I may. Thanks so much for the talk, and I very much enjoyed it. I think it's certainly along the right track. But here's a bothering thought. Okay, so premise one: Kuhn was historically sensitive. Okay, premise two: there's a wide variety in the Vienna Circle. So at some point, Schlick was a foundationalist. At some other point, Neugat was a coherentist. At some point, I thought Carnap was sort of closer to Bergman. But then I found, as you were giving your talk, I apologize, I found this scathing review by Carnap in 1945 of Hall and Begman. That was just utterly just smashing, right? And so it seems as though these folks are really so varied, right? And so question by way of conclusion, why would Kuhn take logical empiricism as a target in this kind of homogeneous fashion, indistinctly between all of these folks, right? So what do you think?
Right, right. So if I understand your question or the point, it's, you know, why would we even think that Kuhn would have gone after logical empiricism in the first place, given that it's so diverse and such a, you know, why would we even think that that would be the case?
Why would he represent it as homogeneous, given his historical sensitivity?
Right. Yeah. And yeah. So the first thing I will say is I yeah, I don't think that Kuhn himself is responsible. And this is a definitely something that I should address more in the paper. I don't think Kuhn himself is responsible for the conclusion that, you know, that he killed the Vienna Circle or that he went up against logical empiricism. I think this is something that other people said. So for instance, there's a report of Marjorie Green writing to, it was probably Polanyi, I think, saying that it was very ironic that structure was published in the Encyclopedia of Unified Science, right? And that, you know, and a lot of people noted at the time that it was very ironic and strange that this would have been published in this book, given that it seemed so strange to people that because Kuhn was going up against a lot of what were perceived as classic logical empiricist doctrines. But you're absolutely right. Like there are no classic logical empiricist doctrines in a way, right? Like I mean, if you just look at any two of the figures, you know, it's like they're so far apart from each other. They have and really in a strange way, the only person who, you know, some of the people who actually do live up to the received view, right? Like the sort of conglomeration view that people imposed on logical empiricism from the outside are really people like Hempel and Salmon, you know, who were never part of the Vienna Circle. Like they may belong to the tradition of logical empiricism, right? But they don't historically belong to the Vienna Circle. And so I think you're right that, but in a way, this is exactly my point. And I'm following up again here from this nice paper by Sebastian Lutz. The idea of a received view is just, it's historically inaccurate, right? The idea that there's just one set of doctrines that everybody believed and that they all, I mean, there was this kind of fun thing that you can just, I know everybody wants to, it's late for you, but that's, there was this fun thing where you can see this if you go to the Pitt Phil Sci archive, including online. There was this fun exercise that they did where they wrote a bunch of different statements from Wittgenstein, and then they all wrote down whether they agreed with them with each statement. And so there were, you know, there were cases where the Vienna Circle kind of took the temperature of who agreed with whom about what. But, you know, even just Schlick versus Reichenbach, right? I mean, these are two very similar philosophers within the Vienna Circle, but there are huge differences between their approaches, right? And so it's absolutely true that to think that structure was sort of taking aim at logical empiricism as a homogeneous entity is actually kind of, I'm not going to say silly, but unrealistic. Absolutely.
Great, wonderful, thank you. I feel vindicated. Thanks for the talk. Let's see if there are some more questions, comments, rejoinders. And if not, a very brief follow-up. If things stand as you present them to stand, is there any kind of a move in the instruction in HPS that you think should be achieved so that folks could move away from these overarching categories and could explore the intricacies of the finer threads that are weaved in these large scale movements?
Oh, that's an excellent question that would take another hour to answer. Yeah, I mean, I think that so the discussion in Kuhn about how physics is taught is kind of relevant here, because Kuhn talks about that, you know, physics presents its history as, you know, it's not just Whiggish, it's that it's all of the concepts lead up to the approach of the present day. And I think that in some ways, the account according to which logical empiricists kind of founded philosophy of science, and then Kuhn threw a huge bomb into the middle of that and it just blew up, is very convenient in some ways, you know, for us to tell the story, because then it also explains why certain figures, you know, rose to prominence when they did. It explains why, but I think that what we'll probably have to do is there will have to be work sort of establishing an alternative timeline and an alternative structure that can then be taught, right? So just very, very quickly, because I know everyone wants to, it's the evening. I think very, very quickly, there are papers that get taught in textbooks like Tom Kuhn and Tom Bayes and you know, the sort of standard papers that get taught on scientific realism from different, and I think that if we had something that could be just cited and taught that just laid out very clearly exactly what happened, that would be helpful. So I think, but yeah, I absolutely think that HPS shouldn't be taught as a kind of, you know, and then there was logical empiricism, and then it immediately just was completely vanquished by Kuhn and was never heard from again. That seems quite clearly false, especially given the number of people who had been taught by the logical empiricists who went on to be fundamental in philosophy of science.
That's absolutely wonderful. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Thanks so much for that. And please join me in thanking Professor Patton for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everyone.